The air had turned wrong. It pressed down on Whitmore Mansion like a hand over a dying man's mouth. Thick, hot, and suffocating even as the sun bled out behind the South Carolina pines. The sky had taken on the color of a fresh bruise, purple and green at the edges while something massive gathered itself beyond the horizon. Lightning flickered in the distance without sound, illuminating clouds that roiled like boiling water. Isaiah felt the chains before he heard them. The iron cuffs had worn grooves into his wrists over the past year, but tonight they seemed heavier, as if the metal itself sensed what was coming. He stood in the cookhouse doorway, watching the storm build, when Overseer Silas Creed's shadow fell across him like a curse. "Master wants to see you, boy." Isaiah didn't move. He was 32 years old, lean and scarred, with eyes that had long ago stopped showing fear. That absence of fear was what made him dangerous. That absence was what had brought Creed here now, with 2 other white men behind him, field hands pressed into service as enforcers when the regular brutality required extra hands. I said move. Creed's voice carried the lazy confidence of a man who'd never been denied. He was tall and raw-boned, with a face like weathered leather and teeth stained brown from tobacco. His right hand rested on the coiled whip at his belt. Isaiah looked past him toward the mansion. Whitmore Mansion rose from the Carolina earth like a monument to stolen wealth. 3 stories of white columns and black shutters, wide verandas wrapped around the lower floors, and windows that caught the dying light and reflected nothing back. 57 windows, Isaiah had counted. 57 hollow eyes watching everything, judging nothing. The house had been built by enslaved hands 40 years ago, every brick laid with blood and sweat that would never be repaid. 4 generations of Whitmores had grown fat within those walls, and each generation had found new cruelties to justify their prosperity. "You deaf boy?" Creed stepped closer. Isaiah finally moved, but not the way Creed expected. He walked forward, directly toward the overseer, and stopped only when they stood close enough that Creed could smell the cookhouse smoke on his clothes. "I ain't your boy," Isaiah said quietly, "and I ain't deaf." The first blow came fast, Creed's fist catching Isaiah across the jaw, snapping his head sideways. The metallic taste of blood filled Isaiah's mouth, but he didn't fall, didn't even stumble. He straightened slowly, his eyes never leaving Creed's face, and smiled with red-stained teeth. That smile was what condemned him. "Get the chains," Creed said to the men behind him. "This one's forgotten his place." From the kitchen house window, Delilah watched them drag Isaiah toward the punishment shed behind the stables. Her hands never stopped working. She was cutting carrots for tomorrow's soup, but her eyes followed every step. Every stumble when Isaiah's feet caught on the uneven ground, every vicious yank of the chain. She was 46 years old, though she looked 60. The Whitmore kitchen had consumed her youth the way fire consumed wood, leaving only ash and embers. Her fingers were calloused from decades of cutting and stirring, her back permanently bent from hours over hot stoves, her lungs scarred from breathing smoke in this airless room. But her mind was sharp, sharper than any knife in her kitchen, and she knew what Isaiah's smile meant. It meant the waiting was almost over. "They're gonna kill him this time," said Ruth from the corner. The girl was 22, beautiful in the way that made her a target, with skin the color of mahogany and eyes that held more pain than any 22-year-old should carry. She stood at the wash basin, scrubbing pots with mechanical precision, her hands moving on their own while her mind went somewhere else, somewhere safer. "Not yet," Delilah said. "Master Bartholomew likes his lessons to last. He'll want Isaiah alive for a while, long enough to scream." Thunder finally caught up with the lightning, a low rumble that shook the windows in their frames. The storm was coming closer. Ruth's hand stopped moving. "I can't hear it again." "I can't, then don't listen." Delilah's voice was harder than she intended. She set down her knife and crossed to the girl, gripping her shoulders. "You go to your quarters. You stuff cotton in your ears. You sing every hymn you know. But you don't break. Not now, you hear me?" Ruth's eyes were wet, but she nodded. "Good girl. Now go." After Ruth fled into the gathering darkness, Delilah returned to her carrots, but her hands trembled slightly and she had to pause to steady them. She'd sent 5 children down to the punishment shed over the years. 3 of them had come back. The other 2 were buried in unmarked graves beyond the cotton fields, their names forbidden to be spoken. Isaiah would come back. He had to, because without Isaiah there was no hope. There was only this: An endless cycle of cooking and serving and watching while the Whitmores ate food prepared by hands they considered less than human. The kitchen door opened, bringing with it a gust of wind that smelled like rain and something else, something electric and wild. Moses stood in the doorway, his ancient frame silhouetted against the purple sky. He was 70 if he was a day. Born free in a northern state he could barely remember, kidnapped and sold south before his 8th birthday. His hair was white as cotton, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, but his eyes were clear and sharp. They got him in the shed, Moses said. I know. Creed brought his special tools. Delilah's knife slipped, nicking her finger. Blood welled up, bright red against her dark skin. She watched it for a moment, then wrapped the wound in a rag. How long you think he'll last? Long as he needs to. Moses stepped inside and closed the door. Isaiah ain't like the others. He's got iron in him, the kind that don't bend. Iron breaks if you hit it hard enough. Maybe. But sometimes it breaks the hammer. They stood in silence, listening to the storm approach. The wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Somewhere in the distance, Isaiah's first scream cut through the air like a knife through silk. Delilah flinched but didn't look away from her work. The blood in these walls is calling for justice, she whispered. Moses nodded slowly. Then let's hope justice is listening. Inside the mansion's great parlor, Bartholomew Whitmore sat in his leather chair by the fireplace, even though no fire burned in the August heat. He was 61 years old, with the thick neck and florid face of a man who'd spent his life eating too much and exercising too little. His beard was carefully trimmed, his suit expensive but sweat-stained at the armpits. In his right hand he held a crystal glass of bourbon. In his left a ledger showing numbers that made his stomach churn. The plantation was dying. Had been dying for years, though he'd hidden it well. Cotton prices had fallen. Competition from Western territories had increased. And his own appetites, for fine clothes, expensive horses, elaborate parties, had drained the family coffers faster than the fields could replenish them. He'd made a decision 3 weeks ago. A hard decision, but necessary. He would sell off 20 of his enslaved workers to a sugar plantation in Louisiana. The money would stabilize the estate, pay off his debts, and give him breathing room. The fact that sugar plantations consumed human lives like firewood, that the average survival time was less than 3 years, didn't concern him. They were property, investments. Sometimes investments had to be liquidated. Thunder shook the windows and Bartholomew glanced up at the darkening sky. Another scream drifted in from the punishment shed, thin and distant. He smiled and took a sip of bourbon. His son Clayton entered the parlor, wiping his hands on a silk handkerchief. Clayton was 28, handsome in the way of young men who'd never known hardship, with his father's build but not yet his father's bulk. His eyes held a peculiar emptiness that Bartholomew recognized because he'd seen it in his own mirror. The new girl put up a fight, Clayton said casually. But she learned. Bartholomew didn't ask which girl. Didn't need to. Clayton went through them like other men went through cigars, using them up and discarding them without thought. Is your mother still in her room? With her medicine, yes. Clayton poured himself a bourbon. She'll sleep through until morning. Constance Whitmore had discovered laudanum 5 years ago and hadn't been fully conscious since. It was easier that way. For everyone. And Abigail? Reading poetry in her room. Something about romantic heroes and noble sacrifices. Clayton laughed. She has no idea what nobility actually costs. Another scream from outside. Longer this time. More ragged. Bartholomew raised his glass. To maintain order. Clayton clinked his glass against his father's. To order. They drank while Isaiah screamed and the storm rolled closer. At midnight, the great clock in the entrance hall struck 12 times. Each chime resonated through the mansion like a death knell, echoing off marble floors and mahogany paneling, reverberating through empty corridors where portraits of dead Whitmores watched with painted eyes. The storm had arrived. Rain hammered against the windows with fists of water. Lightning turned the world white for frozen moments, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. Wind screamed around the mansion's corners, finding gaps in the walls, making the whole structure groan like a ship at sea. In the punishment shed, Isaiah hung from iron chains, his back a ruin of torn flesh. But his eyes were open, focused, burning with something that looked like fever but was actually clarity. Creed had left him here to think about obedience. to contemplate his place, to learn humility through suffering. But Isaiah wasn't thinking about any of those things. He was thinking about the shed's construction, how the door hung slightly crooked on its hinges. He was thinking about the distance between here and the stables. He was thinking about Moses and Delilah and Ruth and all the others who'd suffered in silence for so long. He was thinking about fire, about blood, about the moment when the oppressed stop asking for mercy and start taking justice. The storm raged outside, and inside Isaiah's mind, another storm was building, one that would drown this plantation in red. Thunder cracked directly overhead, so close and loud it seemed like the sky was splitting open, and Isaiah smiled through his pain, because he knew. The time was coming. Soon. If you're enjoying this dark tale, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below telling us what terrifies you most. 3 days after the storm, Isaiah returned to the fields. He moved slowly, each step a negotiation with pain, but he moved. The wounds on his back had been treated with salt water and wrapped in rough cloth. Delilah's work, done in the dead of night when even the house's watching windows seemed to sleep. The scars would add to the collection already mapped across his skin, a topography of suffering that told the story of his life better than any words could. But he was alive. And that was its own kind of victory. The August heat had returned with a vengeance, the storm's brief respite forgotten. The sun hammered down on the cotton fields where 37 enslaved people worked in rows that stretched toward a horizon that shimmered with heat mirages. Their hands moved in practiced rhythm, pick, drop, move, pick, drop, move, filling canvas sacks that grew heavier with each passing hour. Creed watched from horseback at the field's edge, his whip coiled and ready. He'd been disappointed that Isaiah survived. The overseer had expected, had hoped for, a lesson written in death. Instead, he'd gotten defiance wrapped in silence. Isaiah hadn't begged, hadn't pleaded, had barely made a sound after those first screams. That worried Creed more than he wanted to admit. Isaiah bent to the cotton plants, his fingers automatically selecting the ripe bolls, and let his eyes scan the field. Thomas worked 3 rows over, a powerful man of 40 with shoulders like an ox and hands that could break a man's neck. Eliza, his wife, worked beside him, her belly swollen with their 4th child. That child would be born into chains, property of the Whitmores before it drew its first breath, unless something changes. The thought settled into Isaiah's mind like a seed into soil, and he knew it was time. Time to speak the words that couldn't be unspoken. Time to light the fuse and watch what burned. Inside the mansion, Ruth climbed the servant's stairs with a breakfast tray balanced on her hip. Her feet knew every creaking board, every loose nail, every place where the wood had warped with age and moisture. She moved like a ghost through these corridors, trying to be invisible, trying to be nothing. But she was always something to the Whitmores, always a body, always available. She reached the 2nd floor landing and paused, steadying her breathing. The hallway stretched before her, lined with doors that led to bedrooms decorated with silk curtains and imported furniture. Portraits hung between the doors, stern-faced Whitmore ancestors in formal dress, their painted eyes following her movement. Clayton's room was at the end of the hall. Ruth's hands trembled, making the silverware rattle against the china. She forced herself to stillness, to emptiness, to that place inside her mind where feeling couldn't reach. It was a survival skill she'd learned at 16 when Clayton had first noticed her. 6 years of practice had made her good at it. The door was already ajar. She pushed it open with her shoulder and entered. The room smelled of whiskey and stale cologne. Clayton sat at his writing desk by the window, still in his nightshirt, staring out at the grounds below. He didn't turn when she entered. Set it on the table, he said. Ruth crossed to the small table near his bed and carefully placed the tray, eggs, toast, ham, coffee. The same breakfast he ate every morning, prepared by Delilah's practiced hands. That will be all, Clayton said, his voice distant. Ruth turned to leave, hope flickering in her chest. Maybe today would be different. Maybe today he would let her go unharmed. Wait, the hope died. Clayton turned from the window and his eyes held that peculiar emptiness she'd learned to fear. Not anger, not lust, just nothing. As if she weren't quite real to him. As if what he was about to do didn't really count because she didn't really matter. Close the door, he said. Ruth's hand found the doorknob. For one wild moment she imagined running. fleeing down the hallway, down the stairs, out into the fields, into the swamps, anywhere but here. But she'd seen what happened to runners. I had seen the dogs. I had seen the bodies brought back. She closed the door. In the kitchen house, Delilah moved through her morning routine with mechanical precision. Bread dough needed kneading. Vegetables needed chopping. Meat needed preparation for the evening meal. The work never stopped, and she'd learned long ago that keeping her hands busy kept her mind from breaking. But today, her mind wandered despite her efforts. She thought about Ruth upstairs in that monster's room. She thought about Isaiah, back in the fields with wounds that should have kept him bedridden. She thought about the storm 3 nights ago and how it had felt like a warning, or a promise. The kitchen door opened, and Constance Whitmore glided in like a wraith. The mistress of the house was 57 but looked older, her skin pale and papery, her eyes perpetually dilated from laudanum. She wore a silk dressing gown even though it was nearly noon, her gray hair unpinned and wild around her shoulders. "I need more medicine," Constance said, her voice dreamy and distant. "The bottles in my room are empty." Delilah wiped her hands on her apron and crossed to the medicinal cabinet, a locked wooden box where the household's various tinctures and remedies were kept. She had a key, entrusted to her because the Whitmores couldn't be bothered to fetch their own medicines. "Yes, ma'am," Delilah said, unlocking the cabinet. Inside, rows of brown glass bottles stood like soldiers. Laudanum, arsenic for rats, belladonna for sleeplessness, ipecac for poisoning, wintergreen for aches. And in the back, where Constance's dreamy eyes wouldn't notice, 3 bottles Delilah had prepared herself. Nightshade extract. Concentrated and deadly. She selected a bottle of laudanum and handed it to Constance, whose fingers closed around it with the desperation of a drowning woman grabbing a rope. "Thank you," Constance whispered. Then unexpectedly, do you ever dream, Delilah?" The question was so strange that Delilah actually looked at the white woman's face. Really looked, and saw something there that might have been recognition, might have been guilt, might have been the last traces of humanity drowning in opiate haze. "Yes, ma'am," Delilah said carefully. "I dream." "What do you dream about?" "Freedom, fire, justice, blood running down marble stairs." "I dream about cooking, ma'am. About recipes and such." Constance nodded slowly as if this answer made perfect sense. "I dream about water. Deep dark water, and I'm sinking." She clutched the laudanum bottle to her chest like a child with a doll. "Sometimes I think I'm already at the bottom, that I drowned years ago and just haven't noticed yet." Then she drifted out of the kitchen, leaving Delilah standing alone with her heart pounding and her mind racing. Because for just a moment, Constance had almost seemed human. Almost seemed like someone who understood that this house was built on horrors. But understanding didn't mean anything without action. And Constance Whitmore had spent decades choosing the comfort of oblivion over the discomfort of conscience. Delilah turned back to the medicinal cabinet, her eyes lingering on the Nightshade bottles. Soon, she thought. Very soon. That afternoon, Bartholomew Whitmore sat in his study reviewing ledgers with his factor, a thin, nervous man named Preston Caldwell who handled the plantation's finances. The numbers on the page told a story Bartholomew didn't want to hear. "The debt is unsustainable," Preston said, adjusting his spectacles. "Even with the sale of 20 workers, you'll barely break even. And cotton prices continue to fall. Then we'll plant tobacco next season. Tobacco requires different equipment, different expertise. The initial investment, I don't care about investment." Bartholomew slammed his hand on the desk, making the inkwell jump. "I care about maintaining this estate. This is Whitmore land, has been for 4 generations. I will not be the one to lose it." Preston fell silent, his face pale. Outside the study window, enslaved people moved through the grounds like shadows, carrying water, tending gardens, performing the 1,000 invisible labors that kept the mansion functioning. "There is another option," Preston said quietly. "Speak. Sell the land. All of it. Move to Charleston or Columbia. Invest in shipping or manufacturing. The plantation model is dying, Bartholomew. You can see it if you're willing to look." Bartholomew stared at his factory with cold eyes. "Get out. Sir, get out of my house." Preston gathered his papers with shaking hands and fled. Bartholomew remained in his chair, breathing hard, his face flushed dangerous red. Sell Whitmore Mansion? Abandon the land his grandfather had carved from the wilderness? Admit that the natural order, The hierarchy that placed white men at the top and everyone else below was failing? Never. He would die first, would burn it all down first. The irony of that thought wouldn't occur to him until much later, when the flames were already licking at his curtains and his blood was soaking into his expensive carpets. As twilight painted the sky purple and gold, Moses stood in the stables brushing down Bartholomew's favorite mare, a chestnut thoroughbred named Lady. The horse nuzzled his shoulder while he worked, and Moses whispered to her in a language older than slavery, older than this plantation, older than the Whitmores' stolen wealth. He'd been working with horses for 62 years, knew their moods, their fears, their strength, knew which ones would run fast and which would run far, knew which ones would carry riders through fire and which would bolt at the first sign of danger. The Lady would run fast, very fast. Fast enough to reach Charleston in a hard night's ride if the rider knew what they were doing. The stable door opened, and Isaiah slipped inside. His movements were still careful, still pained, but there was purpose in his step. Moses didn't stop brushing Lady, didn't acknowledge Isaiah's presence beyond a slight nod. "Tomorrow night," Isaiah said quietly. "After the evening meal." "The barn?" Moses's hand paused mid-stroke, then continued. "How many?" "Everyone who'll come. Everyone who's ready to choose. Choice between what? Freedom or death? Ain't no middle ground left." Moses finished brushing Lady and hung up the brush with deliberate care. He was 70 years old, had survived longer than most by keeping his head down, his mouth shut, his spirit carefully hidden where overseers couldn't reach it. But he remembered freedom. "I remembered it like a man remembers his mother's face, distant but undeniable. The girl Ruth," Moses said. "She's gonna make it. After what that boy does to her." Isaiah's jaw tightened. "She is stronger than anyone knows, including herself. And Delilah? Delilah has been waiting for this her whole life. She just didn't know what she was waiting for." Moses turned to face Isaiah directly, studying the younger man's face in the fading light. He saw determination there, saw rage carefully controlled, saw the same fire he'd seen in the eyes of rebels and runaways over the decades, the ones who'd chosen death over continued bondage. Most of them had died badly, but some had made it. Some had found the North Star and followed it to something approximating freedom. "You know what you're asking?" Moses said. "You know what comes after? Even if we succeed, even if we kill them all, they'll hunt us. Every white man in Carolina will be hunting us. And when they catch us—" "I know," Isaiah interrupted. "I know what they'll do. But Moses, they're gonna sell 20 of us to Louisiana sugar plantations. You know what that means? 3 years. Maybe less. Worked to death in the cane fields." Moses did know. Everyone knew. Louisiana was a death sentence spoken slowly. "Who are they selling?" Isaiah's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "The families. Thomas and Eliza and their children. Jonah and his wife Sarah, the Reeves family. The Butlers, anyone with children because they fetch higher prices as groups." Moses felt something cold settle into his stomach. The families. The children. Sold south to die slowly while the Whitmores used the money to buy new furniture and imported wine. "When you say tomorrow night," Moses said, "you mean planning? Or you mean doing?" "Planning, preparing. We got maybe 2 weeks before the traders come. Need to be ready." Moses nodded slowly. 70 years old, and he was about to become a revolutionary, about to risk everything for a chance at something he'd almost forgotten was possible. But what was life without the possibility of freedom? Just long dying, just chains that grew heavier with each passing day. "I'll be there," Moses said. That night, after the evening meal had been served and cleared, after the Whitmores had retired to their rooms and the overseers to their quarters, Delilah stood alone in the kitchen house with the door locked and the window shuttered. Candlelight flickered across her face as she opened the medicinal cabinet and removed the 3 bottles of Nightshade extract. She'd been collecting and concentrating the poison for 2 years, not knowing exactly why, just knowing that someday it might matter. That day was coming. She held the bottles up to the light, watching the dark liquid swirl within. Enough here to kill everyone in the mansion twice over. Tasteless when mixed properly, quick-acting when concentrated, but poison was a coward's weapon, a silent weapon, and what was coming wouldn't be silent. Still, it could be useful. Could incapacitate. Could make targets helpless when the time came for more direct justice. Delilah returned the bottles to the cabinet and locked it carefully. Then she knelt on the floor. pressing her forehead against the rough wood, and allowed herself one moment of pure terror. One moment to acknowledge what she was planning. What they were all planning. They were going to kill the Whitmores. All of them. Were going to make this house run red with the blood of their oppressors. And if they failed, they would die in ways that would make Isaiah's whipping look like mercy. Her moment of terror passed. She stood, smoothed her apron, and blew out the candles. In the darkness, she whispered words her grandmother had taught her. Words in a language the Whitmores had tried to beat out of her people, but which survived in whispers and memories. Words about justice. About balance. About the debts that blood eventually demands. Outside, the night insects sang their endless song. Somewhere in the fields, a night bird called, and in the mansion's great clock, gears turned and springs wound tighter, counting down toward midnight, toward the moment when everything would change, toward blood. If you're enjoying this dark tale, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below telling us what terrifies you most. The barn smelled of hay and horse sweat and fear. 7 people sat in a circle on the dirt floor, their faces barely visible in the darkness. No lanterns, no candles, just moonlight filtering through gaps in the wooden slats, painting silver lines across their features. Isaiah had chosen the barn carefully, far enough from the mansion that voices wouldn't carry, close enough that their absence wouldn't be noted if anyone checked the quarters. Moses sat with his back against a support beam, his ancient joints protesting but his mind sharp. Delilah was to his right, her cook's hands folded in her lap, deceptively calm. Ruth huddled beside her, arms wrapped around her knees, her eyes distant. Jonah the blacksmith sat across from Isaiah, a mountain of a man with arms like tree trunks and burn scars covering his forearms. His wife Sarah was beside him, small and fierce, her eyes bright with barely contained rage. Thomas and Eliza completed the circle, their hands clasped together so tightly their knuckles had gone pale. "They're coming in 12 days, Isaiah said without preamble. "The traitors. From Charleston. Coming to take 20 of us south," Sarah's breath hitched. "Which 20? "The families. Anyone with children. Anyone who'll fetch a higher price sold as a group." Thomas closed his eyes. Eliza's free hand moved to her swollen belly, protective and futile. Their 3 children slept in the quarters, unaware that in 12 days they might be loaded onto wagons and taken to a place where childhood ended in the cane fields. "We could run," Sarah whispered. "Take the children and run tonight." "They'd catch us by dawn," Jonah said, his voice like gravel. "Dogs would find us before we made it 5 miles. And what they'd do when they brought us back." He didn't finish. I didn't need to. They all knew what happened to runaways. "So what are we talking about here?" Thomas asked, his eyes on Isaiah. "What exactly are you proposing?" Isaiah leaned forward, his face moving into a shaft of moonlight. The healing wounds on his back pulled tight, but he ignored the pain. "We kill them. All of them. The Whitmores, the overseers, anyone who stands in our way. We take weapons, supplies, and horses. We split up and scatter. Some head for Charleston and the contact there. Some go into the swamps. Some go west. Make it impossible to track everyone." Silence filled the barn like water. Outside, crickets sang their mechanical song. A horse shifted in its stall, restless. "That's murder," Eliza said quietly. That's damnation." "Damnation?" Ruth's voice cracked like breaking glass. Everyone turned to look at her. She'd barely spoken since entering the barn, but now words poured out like poison from a wound. "Is it damnation when Clayton Whitmore forces himself on me? When he uses me like I'm nothing? Is that God's will? Is that righteous?" Tears streamed down her face, but her voice grew stronger. "I'm already in hell. I have been for 6 years. If killing them damns me worse, then so be it. At least I'll have one moment, one single moment when I'm not a victim." Delilah pulled Ruth close, holding her while she shook. "Hush now, child, hush." But Ruth wasn't done. 12 days until they sell the families. How many days until Clayton kills me? How many days until Creed beats someone else to death? How many days until this mansion takes everything from all of us? She looked around the circle, her eyes wild. "I say we burn it down. Burn it all down and dance in the ashes." Moses stirred, his old voice cutting through the tension. "I was born free. Did you know that? A long time ago, in a place so far north I can barely remember what it looked like. My mama sang me songs in a language she learned from her mama. We had a house, had land, had names we chose for ourselves." He paused, his eyes distant with memory. Then white men came with chains and papers that said we were property now. Said the law allowed it, said God ordained it. He looked at each of them in turn. I've spent 62 years in bondage waiting for the law to change, waiting for God to intervene, waiting for white folks to grow a conscience. His voice hardened. I'm done waiting. If we die doing this, at least we die as people making a choice. That's more freedom than I've had in 6 decades. Jonah nodded slowly. I can get us weapons. The forge has hammers, axes, tools I can sharpen to edges. And I know where Creed keeps the rifles, in the tack room, locked cabinet. Ruth, you still got that key you took from Clayton's room? Ruth's hand went to a leather cord around her neck, hidden beneath her collar. She pulled it out, revealing a small brass key. I took it 3 months ago. He never noticed. Good. Isaiah's voice carried the weight of command now. Here's what we do. Jonah, you start sharpening tools. Anything that can cut or crush. Do it quietly, little by little, so no one notices. Moses, you prepare the horses. Figure out which ones can run fast and far. Delilah, you keep working in that kitchen. Keep track of the Whitmores' routines, and find a way to make them helpless when the time comes. Delilah's hand unconsciously touched her apron pocket, where she kept the medicinal cabinet key. I can do that. Thomas, Eliza, you spread the word carefully. Not to everyone. Only the ones you trust completely. The ones who will fight when the moment comes. The ones who'd rather die free than live in chains. How many do you think that is? Thomas asked. Isaiah considered. Maybe 20. Maybe less. The old folks, the children, they can't fight. Won't ask them to. But the strong ones, the angry ones, the ones with nothing left to lose. He paused. Enough. It'll be enough. And when? Sarah asked. When do we do this? Sunday. 11 days from now. After church, after the big meal when they're full and lazy. We dose their food, make them weak. Then we strike fast and hard. Sunday's the Lord's day. Eliza protested weakly. The Lord ain't done much for us lately, Ruth said bitterly. Over the next week, the plantation seemed to hold its breath. To an outside observer, nothing had changed. The enslaved still worked the fields, served the meals, and tended the grounds. The Whitmores still lounged in luxury, oblivious. The overseers still enforced their brutal order. But beneath the surface, a transformation was taking place. In the forge, Jonah's hammer rang out its steady rhythm, but now each strike had purpose beyond the horseshoes and hinges he was supposedly making. Scythes gained edges sharp enough to cut through bone. Axes were honed to razor precision. A crowbar disappeared from the tool shed, hidden in the straw of Jonah's sleeping quarters. Moses moved through the stables, whispering to horses in the darkness. He noted which saddles were in best repair, which bridles would hold under hard riding, which mounts had the stamina for a desperate flight. Lady, the chestnut thoroughbred, and 3 other horses began receiving extra feed, building their strength for what was coming. In the kitchen, Delilah orchestrated her deadly symphony. She switched the Whitmores' sleeping drafts with stronger doses, gradually increasing the amount until they relied on her medicine to sleep at all. She noted their eating habits, their preferences, their schedules, and late at night when the house slept, she practiced mixing nightshade extract into gravies and sauces, testing combinations until the bitter taste disappeared completely. Ruth moved through the mansion like a ghost, memorizing every room, every door, every exit. She noted where Bartholomew kept his pistol, in his study desk loaded, where Creed stored extra ammunition, in the overseer's cabin in a wooden box under his bed, where the Whitmores kept their money, in a safe behind a portrait in Bartholomew's bedroom. And every night she endured Clayton's abuse with a new knowledge burning inside her. This would end. Soon, this would end. Isaiah worked the fields with mechanical precision while his mind planned angles of attack, sequences of violence, contingencies for every possible complication. He whispered to Thomas, who whispered to others, building a network of the willing. Not everyone would fight. Some were too afraid, too broken, too invested in survival to risk rebellion. But 19 people, 19 souls pushed past endurance, agreed to stand when the moment came. 19 against 5 Whitmores and 3 overseers. Odds that looked good until you factored in guns, horses, and the entire apparatus of white supremacy that would mobilize the moment word spread. They had one chance. One narrow window between the poisoning and the alarm being raised. They had to kill everyone who could identify them, gather supplies, and scatter before neighboring plantations learned what had happened. It was an insane plan, A desperate plan. It was their only plan. On the Saturday night before the Sunday that would drown Whitmore Mansion in blood, Isaiah stood alone in the fields under a sky full of stars. The cotton plants rustled in the night breeze, a sound like whispered prayers or whispered curses. Impossible to tell which. Tomorrow, he would become a killer. Would stain his hands with blood that no amount of washing would ever truly remove. Would commit acts that white law would call monstrous and that some part of him, the part raised on Bible verses and notions of sin, would struggle to justify. But another part of him, the part that had survived 32 years of bondage and brutality, knew the truth. Sometimes justice looks like violence. Sometimes freedom requires blood. Sometimes the only way out of hell is to burn it down on your way through. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Another storm building. Isaiah smiled grimly. The weather itself seemed to be on their side, providing cover for what was coming. Behind him, footsteps in the dirt. He turned to find Ruth, her face pale in the starlight. "Can't sleep," she said. "Me neither." They stood together in silence, two people on the edge of transformation. Tomorrow they would either die or be reborn. There was no middle ground left. "I'm not sorry," Ruth said quietly, "for what we're about to do. I know I should be, but I'm not." "Good," Isaiah said. "Sorry people don't survive revolutions. Is that what this is? A revolution? It's justice. Long overdue," Ruth nodded slowly. Then in a voice so soft he almost missed it. "Thank you for giving me this chance. To fight back, to matter." Isaiah reached out and squeezed her shoulder. "You've always mattered, Ruth. They just tried to make you forget it." Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human suffering, indifferent to human rage. But tomorrow, the stars would witness what happened when the oppressed stopped asking permission to be human and started taking their humanity back by force. Tomorrow, Whitmore Mansion would learn what it meant to reap what it had sown. Tomorrow, the blood will flow. If you're enjoying this dark tale, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below telling us what terrifies you most. Sunday morning arrived with oppressive heat that pressed down on Whitmore Mansion like a fever dream. The sky was white, bleached of color by the merciless sun. Not a breath of wind stirred the magnolia trees that flanked the circular drive. Even the birds seemed reluctant to sing, as if nature itself sensed what was coming and had fallen silent in anticipation. At 8 o'clock, the plantation bell rang, the signal for Sunday service. Enslaved people emerged from their quarters in their Sunday clothes, threadbare and patched but clean. They formed a somber procession toward the plantation chapel, a small white building with a crooked steeple that Bartholomew Whitmore had built to demonstrate his Christian devotion. Isaiah walked among them, his face carefully blank. Ruth moved like a sleepwalker. Moses shuffled with exaggerated age, playing the part of a harmless old man. Delilah kept her eyes downcast, her hands clasped as if in prayer. Jonah's massive frame seemed diminished, shoulders hunched in submission. They were all wearing masks. I had been wearing them for years. But today the masks would come off. The Whitmores arrived in their carriage, Bartholomew and Constance, Clayton and Abigail. They swept into the chapel's front pew, while the enslaved people filled the rough benches behind them. A traveling preacher, a rail-thin man named Reverend Thaddeus Pike, stood at the pulpit with his Bible open and sweat already staining his collar. "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers," Reverend Pike intoned, his voice nasal and self-righteous, "for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God." Isaiah's hands clenched in his lap. Romans 13. The same scripture they always used, twisting God's word into chains. "Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in the singleness of your heart, as unto Christ." Ruth's breathing quickened. Delilah placed a steadying hand on her knee. The sermon continued for an hour. An endless drone about obedience, about knowing one's place, about the divine order that placed white men at the top and everyone else below. Bartholomew dozed in the front pew. Clayton stared at Ruth with predatory eyes. Constance swayed slightly, already lost in her laudanum haze. Abigail read a book of poetry hidden in her Bible, bored by the same sermon she'd heard 100 times before. When it finally ended, the Whitmores filed out first as always. The enslaved people followed, heads bowed, maintaining the performance. But as Isaiah passed through the chapel door into the blazing sunlight, his eyes met Moses's, then Jonah's, then Delilah's. Soon, very soon. The Sunday meal was always an elaborate affair at Whitmore Mansion. It was Bartholomew's weekly demonstration of wealth and refinement. A 4-course dinner served on imported china with crystal goblets and silver utensils that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Delilah had been preparing since dawn in the kitchen house. She worked with Ruth and 2 other house servants, orchestrating a meal that would be the Whitmores' last. Roasted pork shoulder glazed with honey and herbs, buttermilk biscuits light and flaky, collard greens cooked with bacon, candied yams, corn pudding, and for dessert peach cobbler with cream. But into the gravy that would smother the pork, Delilah stirred something else. Her hands were steady as she added the nightshade extract, carefully measured, perfectly mixed. The bitter taste disappeared completely into the rich, savory sauce, into the wine that would fill the crystal goblets. She added crushed sleeping powder, triple the normal dose, into the cream for the cobbler, more nightshade, just enough to ensure the job was finished. Ruth watched from the doorway, her face pale but determined. "How long until it works?" "Depends," Delilah said quietly. "The wine will make them drowsy within 30 minutes. The nightshade takes longer, maybe an hour. Won't kill them, but it'll make them weak, confused, easy targets. And if they notice something's wrong, then we improvise." Delilah's voice was hard as iron. "But they won't notice. Rich folks never notice what's right in front of them, especially when it's prepared by hands they don't consider human." At 1 o'clock the meal was ready. Ruth and another servant carried the dishes to the mansion's great dining room on silver trays. The room was magnificent, mahogany table that could seat 20, crystal chandelier hanging from a painted ceiling, portraits of dead Whitmores watching from the walls, windows overlooking the manicured gardens. The Whitmore family took their seats. Bartholomew at the head of the table, Constance to his right, Clayton and Abigail on either side. They didn't acknowledge the servants who placed food before them, didn't say thank you, didn't see them as anything more than animated furniture. Ruth poured the wine with hands that only trembled slightly. The dark red liquid filled each glass, innocent and deadly. "To another prosperous week," Bartholomew said, raising his goblet. "To prosperity," the others echoed. They drank deeply. The poisoned wine slid down their throats like silk. Outside, the air had changed. Darkness was falling with unnatural speed, though it was only mid-afternoon. Storm clouds had materialized from nowhere, rolling across the white sky like ink spreading through water. Thunder rumbled in the distance, growing closer. Isaiah stood at the edge of the cotton fields, watching the mansion's windows. Beside him, Jonah gripped a hammer with a handle he'd wrapped in cloth to muffle sound. Thomas held a sharpened scythe. Moses had emerged from the stables with an axe that gleamed wickedly in the strange twilight. 19 people, armed with farm tools in desperation, waited for the signal. In the mansion, the Whitmores ate their poisoned meal. Bartholomew noticed it first, a heaviness in his limbs, a strange disconnection between his thoughts and his body. He'd consumed 3 glasses of wine more than usual, and the room seemed to tilt slightly when he moved his head. "This pork is excellent," Clayton said, but his words came out slurred. He blinked, confused, and reached for his water glass. His hand knocked it over instead, sending water spreading across the white tablecloth. "Clayton," Constance scolded, but her voice was weak. She tried to stand, and her legs buckled, dropping her back into her chair. I don't feel well." Abigail set down her fork with exaggerated care. "Mother, what's wrong?" "The wine," Bartholomew said, his mind working slowly through the fog. "Something's wrong with the wine." He tried to stand, to call for help, to reach the bell pull that would summon servants. But his body wouldn't obey. His legs were lead. His arms were distant things, barely connected to his will. Terror cut through the drug haze. "We've been poisoned," he gasped. The dining room doors, both of them, swung open simultaneously. Ruth stepped through the servant's entrance, a kitchen knife in her hand. Her face was transformed, no longer that of a victim, but of something fierce and unbreakable. Behind her, Delilah appeared, holding a cast-iron skillet like a weapon. Through the main doors came Isaiah, Moses, and Jonah. They filled the doorway like avenging angels, their faces hard, their makeshift weapons ready. Lightning flashed outside the windows, turning the world white. Thunder cracked so close it rattled the chandelier, making crystal drops chime like funeral bells. Clayton tried to rise, managed to get halfway up before his legs gave out. He crashed against the table, sending dishes clattering. "What is this?" he demanded. "What have you done?" "Justice," Ruth said quietly. She moved forward with terrible purpose. Clayton's eyes widened as he realized what was coming. Tried to scramble backward, tried to scream. But the poison had stolen his strength, his coordination, his escape. Ruth raised the knife. For 6 years she had endured his abuse, had felt powerless, voiceless, less than human. But now, in this moment, she was transformed. She was the weapon of her own liberation. The knife descended. Clayton's scream cut off abruptly as the blade found his throat. Blood sprayed across the white tablecloth, across the china, across Ruth's face and hands. He fell backward, clutching uselessly at the wound, his mouth working soundlessly, his eyes shocked and disbelieving. Ruth stood over him, breathing hard, covered in his blood. And for the first time in 6 years, she smiled. Bartholomew tried to crawl away from the table, his fingers scrabbling uselessly on the polished floor. "Please," he gasped. "Please, I'll free you all. I'll sign the papers. Just please." Isaiah crossed to him in 3 strides. He looked down at the man who had beaten him, starved him, worked him like an animal for years. The man who had planned to sell families to death in Louisiana sugar fields. The man who had built his wealth on stolen lives and stolen labor. "Too late for mercy," Isaiah said. "You should have thought about that years ago." Jonah's hammer fell. The sound was wet and final. Constance screamed, a thin, reedy sound before Delilah's skillet silenced her. Abigail tried to run, made it 3 steps toward the door before Moses caught her. She fought with surprising strength, her book of poetry falling from her hands, pages scattering across the bloodied floor. But she was young and drugged and alone, and Moses was old but strong and desperate for freedom. When it was over, the dining room looked like an abattoir. Blood covered the floors, the walls, the overturned chairs. The white tablecloth was soaked in crimson. The crystal chandelier swayed overhead, its facets reflecting red light like 1,000 tiny eyes witnessing the carnage. 5. Whitmores lay dead. 4 generations of tyranny ended in less than 5 minutes. Outside, the storm broke. Rain hammered against the windows like fists, as if the sky itself was trying to wash away the sin of what had just happened, or perhaps celebrating it. Isaiah stood in the center of the massacre, breathing hard, his hands covered in blood. He looked around at the others, at Ruth trembling but alive, at Delilah staring at Constance's body, at Moses gripping his axe, at Jonah who had crossed a line he could never uncross. "It's done," Isaiah said. "But we're not finished. The overseers, we need to—" Gunfire exploded from outside, the sound of boots on the veranda. Voices shouting, Creed had heard the screams. The mansion doors burst open, and the second phase of the battle began. The entrance hall erupted into chaos. Silas Creed burst through the front doors with his rifle raised, Garrett Hale and Vernon Dutch flanking him. They'd been in the overseer's cabin when the screams started, drinking whiskey and playing cards. Now they stood frozen in the doorway, taking in the scene before them. The blood-soaked dining room visible through the open doors, the bodies of their employers scattered like broken dolls, and Isaiah standing in the center of it all with Bartholomew Whitmore's blood still wet on his hands. For one suspended moment, no one moved. Lightning flashed through the tall windows, freezing them all in stark white light. Thunder followed instantly, so close it shook the crystal chandelier. Then Creed's rifle barked. The shot went wide, punching through the doorframe beside Isaiah's head and sending splinters flying. Isaiah dove behind an overturned dining chair as the overseers opened fire. Bullets tore through the mansion's expensive furnishings, shattering a mirror, punching holes in a portrait of Bartholomew's grandfather, splintering the mahogany sideboard. But Isaiah wasn't alone. From the servants' entrance, Thomas emerged with the sharpened scythe. He moved low and fast, circling wide while the overseers focused their fire on the dining room. Eliza followed him carrying a butcher knife. Moses came through another door, his axe ready. The mansion had become a killing ground, and the enslaved knew its geography better than their oppressors ever could. They knew the hidden passages, the servant corridors, the ways to move unseen through the house they'd cleaned and maintained for years. Garrett Hale turned at the sound of footsteps behind him. Too late. Thomas's scythe caught him across the midsection, the sharpened blade cutting deep. Hale screamed and fired wildly, his shot going into the ceiling before he collapsed. His blood spread across the polished marble floor of the entrance hall, mixing with rainwater that was blowing in through the open doors. Vernon Dutch scrambled backward, trying to reload his rifle with shaking hands. He made it halfway up the grand staircase before Jonah appeared at the top. The blacksmith had circled through the house using the servant stairs, coming up behind the overseer's position. Dutch raised his rifle. Jonah hurled his hammer with devastating accuracy. The heavy tool struck Dutch in the chest, crushing his sternum. He tumbled backward down the stairs, his body making sick wet sounds with each impact, until he lay sprawled at the bottom, neck bent at an impossible angle. That left Creed. The head overseer had retreated into the mansion's portrait gallery, a long room lined with paintings of Whitmore ancestors. He'd managed to reload, and now he fired methodically, trying to keep the revolutionaries at bay. His first shot caught Thomas in the shoulder, spinning him around. Eliza screamed and dragged her husband behind cover. "You'll all hang for this," Creed roared, his voice echoing through the mansion. "Every one of you! They'll hunt you down like dogs." Isaiah circled around through the library, his movements careful and silent. Blood dripped from a gash on his arm where shrapnel from Creed's first shot had caught him, but adrenaline made him barely feel it. He could hear the overseer's heavy breathing from the next room, and hear the creak of floorboards as Creed moved. "You hear me?" Creed was still shouting. "You think this ends here? You think killing us makes you free? Every plantation in Carolina will be looking for you. Every white man with a gun will be hunting you." Ruth appeared in the doorway to the portrait gallery, her dress still soaked with Clayton's blood. Creed swung his rifle toward her. "You," he snarled, his face twisted with rage and something like betrayal, as if she'd violated some natural law by fighting back. "You ungrateful little," he never finished. Ruth had learned something from 6 years of abuse. She'd learned how to read men, how to predict them, how to survive them. She knew Creed would fixate on her, would see her as the weakest target, and would underestimate her the way they all did. She'd counted on it. Isaiah came through the library door behind Creed and drove a fireplace poker through the overseer's back. The iron rod punched through flesh and muscle, emerging from Creed's chest in a spray of blood. The rifle fell from his hands, clattering on the hardwood floor. Creed looked down at the metal protruding from his body, his face showing incomprehension, then pain, then nothing. Isaiah released the poker and Creed collapsed forward, falling against a portrait of Bartholomew's great-grandfather. His blood splattered across the painting, running down the canvas like tears, obscuring the stern white face beneath. Ruth walked forward slowly, looking down at the man who had dragged Isaiah to the punishment shed, who had beaten countless others, who had been the instrument of Whitmore brutality for 15 years. She spat on his corpse. "Should have run," she said quietly. The mansion was a charnel house now. Bodies lay in every room, Whitmores in the dining room, overseers scattered through the lower floor. Blood had soaked into the expensive oriental rugs, spread across marble tiles, dripped down the grand staircase's carved banister. The air was thick with the copper smell of it, mixed with gun smoke and the ozone scent of the storm raging outside. 19 survivors gathered in the entrance hall, surrounded by the carnage they'd created. Some were wounded, Thomas clutching his bleeding shoulder, Isaiah's arm still dripping, one woman named Ada, with a bullet graze across her ribs. 4 of their number lay dead. Eliza had been shot through the heart by Vernon Dutch in those first chaotic seconds. 2 field workers, Marcus and Samuel, had been killed when they tried to rush Garrett Hale, and Sarah, Jonah's wife, had taken a bullet meant for her husband. Jonah knelt beside her body, his massive frame shaking with silent sobs. The woman who'd been fierce and bright was gone, her eyes staring at nothing, blood pooling beneath her. He'd killed 2 overseers, had helped free them all, but the cost was sitting there in his arms, cold and still. "We have to move," Moses said, his voice hoarse. "Shots will have been heard. People will come." Isaiah nodded, forcing himself to think past the exhaustion and pain. "Jonah, brother, I'm sorry. But Moses is right. We need to act fast." Jonah looked up, his eyes red. "They took everything from me, everything. I know. But don't let them take your life too. Sarah wouldn't want that." Slowly, Jonah laid his wife's body down gently and stood. His face had gone blank, the grief transforming into something harder and more dangerous. What do we do? Isaiah looked around at the 15 survivors still standing. We need supplies. Food, water, weapons, money. Search every room. Take anything useful. We've got maybe an hour before someone from a neighboring plantation comes to investigate. Delilah spoke up. What about the bodies? Our people who died? We take them with us, Isaiah said firmly. Bury them properly when we're clear. But we can't leave them here to be desecrated. Ruth had moved to the windows, looking out at the storm. Rain fell in sheets, turning the grounds into a gray blur. Lightning revealed glimpses of the cotton fields, the outbuildings, and the gate at the end of the long drive. There's something else we need to do, she said, her voice distant. A message. So they know this wasn't random. It wasn't chaos. This was justice. Moses understood immediately. Bartholomew. We hang him from the gate. Isaiah hesitated only a moment, then nodded. Do it. Make it clear what happens to slavers. They worked with grim efficiency born of desperation. Groups split up through the mansion, looting everything that might help them survive. Money from Bartholomew's safe, nearly $3,000 in cash and gold coins. Food from the kitchen stores, blankets and clothing. Medicine from Delilah's cabinet. Rifles and ammunition from the overseer's quarters. Moses and Thomas, his wounded shoulder roughly bandaged, dragged Bartholomew's corpse out into the rain. They hauled it down the drive to the plantation's iron gate, fashioned a rope from horsetack and strung the dead master up like a gruesome scarecrow. His body swayed in the wind, a message written in flesh. This is what justice looks like. This is what happens when you push people beyond endurance. Inside, Jonah moved through the mansion like a ghost, gathering the bodies of their fallen. He carried them with reverent care to the rose garden behind the house, a place Constance Whitmore had tended with laudanum-addled devotion. In the rain and lightning, he dug graves while others helped. They laid Eliza, Marcus, Samuel, and Sarah to rest in soil fertilized by decades of enslaved labor, planted in a garden that had always been beautiful and had never been free. Ruth stood over the graves as Jonah filled them in. They died for freedom, she said. That means something. That matters. Does it? Jonah's voice was hollow. They're still dead. We're still hunted. What did we really win here? Ourselves, Isaiah said, joining them. We won ourselves back. Even if just for a moment. Lightning illuminated the mansion behind them. In that flash of white light, it looked different. No longer a symbol of wealth and power, but something else. A tomb. A monument to the death of tyranny, purchased with blood on both sides. Time to burn it, Moses said. They gathered torches, table legs wrapped in oil-soaked cloth from the kitchen. Isaiah took one last look at the mansion that had defined so much of his life. The house that had watched him suffer, that had contained his bondage, that had tried to break his spirit. For everyone who died in these walls, he said. For every child sold, for every woman violated, for every man beaten, for every dream deferred and every life stolen. He threw his torch through a broken window. The flames caught eagerly on the expensive curtains, spreading with hungry speed. Others followed, torches flying through windows and doors, fire racing through rooms soaked in blood, consuming furniture and portraits and all the trappings of stolen wealth. The mansion seemed to want to burn, as if it too had grown tired of the evil it contained and welcomed the purification of flame. As dawn broke gray and watery through the storm, 15 survivors stood at a crossroads 3 miles from the burning mansion. Smoke rose behind them like a pillar of black reaching toward heaven, or hell depending on your theology. They'd split into 3 groups as planned. 5 heading north for the Underground Railroad, 5 going west toward Cherokee territory, 5, including Isaiah, Ruth, Moses, Delilah, and Jonah, making for Charleston and the contact there. Before they parted, they stood in a circle one last time. No words seemed adequate for what they'd done, what they'd lost, what they'd become. Finally, Moses spoke. May God forgive us. And if he don't, Isaiah said, at least we die free. They scattered into the Carolina wilderness as the sun rose on a new day. Behind them, Whitmore Mansion collapsed into itself, flames reaching toward the morning sky, the blood that had soaked its floors evaporating in the heat, rising as red mist. The rebellion was over. The hunt was just beginning. If you're enjoying this dark tale, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below telling us what terrifies you most. The river ran cold and dark, swollen from 3 days of rain. Isaiah stood knee-deep in the water, scrubbing blood from his hands. It came off slowly, reluctantly, staining the current pink before dissipating into the brown flow. Beside him, Ruth washed her face and arms with mechanical precision, her movement suggesting ritual cleansing rather than simple hygiene. The blood of Clayton Whitmore had dried black on her skin, and she wanted every trace of him gone. They'd been running for 6 hours, moving through swamps and pine forests, avoiding roads and any place people might gather. The 5 of them, Isaiah, Ruth, Moses, Delilah, and Jonah, had made better time than expected, driven by adrenaline and terror and the knowledge that every minute counted. Behind them, somewhere in the gray dawn, Whitmore Mansion was still burning. They'd seen the smoke column for the first 3 miles, a black pillar rising into the storm-washed sky like an accusation or a beacon. Depending on who was looking, Moses sat on the riverbank, his ancient body finally showing the strain. His hands trembled as he cupped water to his mouth. Charleston's maybe 20 miles from here. If we push hard, we can make it by tomorrow night. And then what? Jonah's voice was flat, emptied of everything except exhaustion. He stood apart from the others, staring back the way they'd come, as if he could see through miles of forest to the rose garden where Sarah lay buried. Then we find the contact, Isaiah said, the one who can get us north. Pennsylvania, maybe. Somewhere the law can't touch us. You think there's anywhere in this country the law can't touch us? Jonah turned to face them, his eyes hollow. We killed 8 white people, 8. They'll hunt us till we're dead or they are. There ain't no Pennsylvania far enough. Delilah wrung water from her skirt, her face unreadable. Maybe so. But I'd rather die running toward freedom than live one more day in chains. At least we got that choice now. Some choice, Jonah muttered, but he didn't argue further. They rested for 20 minutes, eating hard biscuits Delilah had grabbed from the kitchen stores. The food tasted like ash, like guilt, like victory, impossible to separate one flavor from another. Ruth couldn't swallow more than a few bites before nausea overwhelmed her. You need to eat, Isaiah said gently. Keep your strength up. I keep seeing his face, Ruth whispered. Clayton's face, when he realized what was happening, when he knew I was going to... She stopped, her throat working. Is that wrong? That I'm not sorry? No, Moses said before Isaiah could answer. The old man's voice carried the weight of 70 years of accumulated wisdom and suffering. Ain't nothing wrong with refusing to apologize for your own survival. That boy spent 6 years taking pieces of your soul. You took his life in return. Some might call that justice. Some might call it revenge. But either way, it was yours to take. Ruth nodded slowly, tears mixing with river water on her face. Isaiah stood, his wounded arm aching but functional. We need to move. The sun's fully up now. People will have found the mansion by now, found the bodies, found Bartholomew hanging from that gate. He paused, imagining the scene. White men on horseback staring up at their murdered peer, rage and fear warring on their faces. They'll be organizing search parties, dogs, militia maybe. Let them come, Jonah said darkly. I have nothing left to lose. But we do, Delilah said sharply. We got each other. We got those other 10 who scattered west and north. We got the memory of everyone who died in that mansion, enslaved and fighting. We owe it to them to survive, to tell this story, to make sure what happened at Whitmore Plantation means something. Jonah's jaw worked, but finally he nodded. Then let's move. They traveled through the day, avoiding open ground, staying in the dense forest and swampland where horses couldn't easily follow. The terrain was brutal, ankle-deep mud, thorny undergrowth, snakes coiling in the shadows, insects that bit and stung without mercy. But it was also cover, concealment, the geography of survival. Moses led them, his old legs finding strength from somewhere deep and stubborn. He'd made this journey before, he said. Decades ago, when he'd tried to run back to the north he barely remembered. He'd been caught that time, beaten within an inch of his life, sold further south as punishment. But he'd learned the land, learned the secret ways through Carolina's wilderness. By afternoon they heard the first sounds of pursuit. Distant dogs baying, the shouts of men coordinating a search. The sounds came from the east, from the direction of the plantation. Isaiah urged them faster, deeper into the swamp where the dogs would lose the scent in the water. They waded through chest-deep channels, holding their supplies above their heads, leeches attaching to their legs. Ruth slipped on submerged roots and went under, came up gasping and terrified before Isaiah hauled her upright. Delilah's strength was flagging, her cook's body not built for this kind of physical ordeal, but she kept moving through sheer will. As the sun began to set, painting the swamp in shades of amber and blood red, they found higher ground, a small island of solid earth covered in live oaks draped with Spanish moss. They collapsed there, too exhausted to go further. Jonah built a small, nearly smokeless fire using techniques he'd learned from an old Cherokee man who'd once worked the plantation. They dried their clothes and ate more of the dwindling food supplies. The night sounds of the swamp rose around them. Frogs, insects, the splash of alligators in the water, the screech of night birds. "Tell me about the North," Ruth said quietly, breaking a long silence. "Tell me what it's like." Moses stared into the fire, his eyes distant. "It's cold. Winters that'll freeze your blood. Snow deeper than a man is tall." He smiled faintly. "But nobody owns you there. You work for wages. You keep your family together. You walk down the street and nobody thinks they got the right to put hands on you just because of your skin." "Sounds like heaven," Ruth said. "It ain't perfect," Moses admitted. "Still got plenty of white folks who hate us. Still got laws that make life hard. But it's better. It's possible. You can build something, can be something other than property." Isaiah watched the fire, thinking about the mansion burning, about the blood soaking into expensive rugs, about Bartholomew Whitmore swaying from the gate. "You think what we did was right?" he asked suddenly. "Killing them all like that?" The question hung in the humid air, right? Delilah repeated the word as if tasting it. "I don't know about right. I know it was necessary. I know they would have kept hurting us, kept killing us, kept selling us until we were all used up and dead. I know we tried asking for mercy for 200 years and never got none." She looked at Isaiah directly. "You want me to feel guilty?" "I can't. I'm too tired, too old, too done with being sorry for surviving." "The Bible says—" Ruth started. "The Bible says a lot of things," Moses interrupted gently. "Says to love your enemies. Also says an eye for an eye. Says to turn the other cheek. Also talks about God drowning the whole world when it got too wicked. Seems to me the Bible's complicated, same as life." Jonah spoke from the darkness beyond the fire. "My Sarah's dead because of what we did. She's on the ground and I'm here and that's my fault. I started us down this road." "No," Isaiah said firmly. "Bartholomew Whitmore started us down this road when he decided human beings could be property. Clayton started us down this road every time he violated Ruth. Creed started us down this road with every lash of his whip. We just finished a journey someone else began." "Pretty words," Jonah said bitterly. "But Sarah's still dead. And if we'd done nothing, she'd still be dead eventually," Isaiah shot back. "Maybe worked to death in the fields. Maybe sold south to the sugar plantations. Maybe dead in childbirth, delivering another enslaved baby to make the Whitmores richer. At least this way she died fighting. She died making a choice." The fire crackled. Somewhere in the swamp something screamed. Animal or human, impossible to tell. Finally, Jonah emerged from the shadows and sat by the fire. His face was haggard, aged a decade in a single day. "You're right. I know you're right. But it still hurts. Good," Moses said. "Means we're still human. The day it stops hurting is the day we become like them." They reached the outskirts of Charleston 2 nights later, exhausted and half-starved, but alive. The city rose before them like a mirage. Buildings and church steeples silhouetted against a sky full of stars. Ships' masts clustered in the harbor, a forest of wood and rope that represented commerce, connection, escape. Moses led them to a warehouse district near the docks, to a building that looked abandoned but wasn't. He knocked 4 times, paused, and knocked twice more. A pattern, a code. The door opened a crack, revealing a black man's face, suspicious and wary. "What do you want?" "Freedom," Moses said simply. "And passage north." The man's eyes scanned them. 5 fugitives covered in swamp mud and dried blood, carrying bundles of stolen goods, radiating desperation and danger. "You the ones from Whitmore Plantation?" Isaiah's hand moved toward the knife at his belt, but Moses stopped him with a touch. "Maybe. Is that a problem?" "Problem?" The man's face split into a grin. "Brother, you're heroes. Come in. Come in before someone sees you." They entered the warehouse, which proved to be a way station on the Underground Railroad, a place where runaways were hidden, fed and moved north through a network of sympathetic abolitionists and free blacks. Their contact was a man named Freeman, whether birth name or chosen name he didn't say. who'd been born free in Philadelphia and dedicated his life to helping others find what he'd been lucky enough to be born into. News travels fast, Freeman said, bringing them water and bread. Whitmore Mansion burned to the ground. The whole family is dead. Overseer's dead. One of the owners hanging from the gate like a warning. White folks are losing their minds, talking about rebellion, about uprisings, about cracking down on every plantation in the state. How many did they catch? Isaiah asked, dreading the answer. None yet. You 5, the 10 that scattered, far as I know, you all made it out. They got the dogs searching, got militia patrols on every road, but you all vanished like ghosts. Freeman's smile was fierce with pride. You did something people will talk about for generations. You struck a blow. We killed 8 people, Ruth said quietly. That's not something to be proud of, isn't it? Freeman leaned forward. How many people did those 8 kill over the years? How many lives did they ruin? How many children did they sell? How many women did they rape? How many men did they beat to death? He shook his head. You ended a cycle of violence that would have continued for another generation. That's justice, sister. Raw and bloody, but justice all the same. Delilah closed her eyes. When can you get us north? The ship leaves tomorrow night. Captain's sympathetic. He'll hide you in the cargo hold, sail you up to Philadelphia. From there you can scatter, build new lives and become new people. Just like that? Jonah's voice was skeptical. We just sail away and everything's fine? No, Freeman said honestly. Everything won't be fine. You'll have nightmares. You'll jump in the shadows. You'll always be looking over your shoulder, wondering if today's the day someone recognizes you. But you'll be alive. You'll be free. And maybe someday you'll be able to look at yourself in a mirror without flinching. The next night, as they boarded the ship under cover of darkness, Isaiah stood at the rail and looked back at Charleston, South Carolina, at everything they were leaving behind, the state where he'd been born into bondage, the land that had taken his childhood, his youth, his dignity, and had nearly taken his life, the state where Whitmore Mansion's ashes were already being scattered by the wind. He thought about Bartholomew swaying from the gate, about the dining room running red with blood, about Clayton's shocked face as Ruth's knife found his throat, about the mansion burning, flames reaching toward heaven like prayers or curses, still impossible to say which. You think we'll ever be able to come back? Ruth asked, joining him at the rail. The city lights reflected in her eyes, making them shine. Maybe, Isaiah said, someday. When things change. When the laws change. When people change, he paused. Or maybe never. Maybe we're exiles now. Maybe the price of freedom is never going home. Home. Ruth repeated the word bitterly. That place was never home. It was a prison. Still, Isaiah said, it's where we're from. Where we became who we are. Moses and Delilah joined them, the 4 of them standing together as the ship prepared to cast off. Jonah remained below deck, unwilling or unable to watch Carolina disappear. I keep thinking about the others, Delilah said, the ones who didn't make it out. The children are too young to run. The old folks are too weak to fight. They're still there. Still enslaved. We can't save everyone, Moses said, but maybe our story will inspire others. Maybe what happened at Whitmore Plantation will be a spark that starts bigger fires. Or maybe we'll just be a cautionary tale, Isaiah said, a story they tell to frighten enslaved people into submission. Remember what happened to the Whitmore rebels, hunted and killed, scattered to the winds? Either way, Ruth said, we fought back. We chose ourselves. That has to count for something. The ship began to move, pulling away from the dock. Charleston's lights grew smaller, more distant. South Carolina became a dark line on the horizon, then nothing at all. Somewhere in that darkness, smoke still rose from the ruins. Blood still stained the soil. Bodies still lay in garden graves. And a message hung in the air like the smell after a storm. This is what happens when you push people too far. This is what happens when you mistake survival for submission. This is what happens when the oppressed stop asking permission to be human. Isaiah felt the weight of it all settle onto his shoulders. The guilt, the pride, the horror, the liberation. He'd killed a man with his own hands, had helped orchestrate the murder of 8 people, had burned a mansion to the ground and scattered a plantation's labor force to the winds. He should feel guilty, should feel like a criminal, should spend every night awash in regret. But standing on the deck of a ship sailing toward freedom, Surrounded by people who'd survived the unsurvivable, Isaiah felt something else entirely. He felt human, for the first time in his 32 years. Looking at a future he'd chosen rather than one forced upon him, Isaiah felt completely and utterly human. The ship sailed on through the darkness. Behind them the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. The colors of fire, the colors of blood, the colors of a new day dawning. They were free. Or they were dead. Or they were something in between. Refugees, rebels, revolutionaries, survivors. But they were no longer slaves. And in the end, that was everything. Thank you for watching. If this story sent chills down your spine, subscribe for more macabre horror tales and share your thoughts in the comments below.